Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. A few of you requested an essay writing video in preparation for the 2020 AP exam, so I wanted to show you guys how I would approach an essay and also give you guys some tips as well. So one of the things that students often ask is, how do I actually write an introduction? What is absolutely necessary? So I have a few samples for you guys here. This is based on the Florence Kelley prompt. I did an annotation video about this previously, so if you guys haven't watched that, then that might help this make a little bit more sense, but you can still hopefully understand it just by watching this video. So one thing to remember is that the most important part of your introduction is going to be your thesis. You need a defensible thesis. And so if you struggle with getting your essay started, then I would recommend having a shorter intro. You don't need a very long and involved intro. You want to get to your body paragraphs. So if that's the case, I would recommend one of these two options. So I have this one right here, which I've labeled just a thesis intro because it's essentially one sentence. And then we have what I called the short intro because it's a couple sentences. So of these two, I prefer for students to do the short intro, but I think it's really a matter of what you are capable of given the passage that you have and the time that you have. So remember, the most important thing is a thesis. Just because a teacher might prefer you to have a couple sentences of context doesn't mean that you absolutely have to on the day of the exam. So let's talk about the thesis intro first. One of the things that I did here is I included a tone word to describe that it's a speech. So you want to identify the type of passage. Having the tone is not necessarily mandatory, but it can be helpful. If you are analyzing a speech or a letter, you also want to have the direct audience. So here I listed it out as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and I talked about how it was from 1905. I don't think that particular detail is absolutely necessary in this sentence, but it can be helpful to talk about the location of the speech or the year of the speech, just to kind of give context to the time period. So this sentence is rather involved, and so if I were to omit anything, I might delete this part right here simply because I think that could be brought up elsewhere in the essay. But you want to make sure that it's clear which passage you're talking about, so you want to give those details. And much of this is actually provided for you in the prompt itself. So that would be the context portion, even though it's one sentence. Let's look at the actual part that makes it a thesis, though, because a thesis has to have choices, and you want to look at the author's purpose. So it says, activist Florence Kelley compares and contrasts the child labor laws in various states, in addition to contrasting the lives of her audience with those of the child laborers, in order to evoke a sense of pity for the children before ultimately calling the suffragists to join with male voters in order to end child labor, thus creating a better future. Okay, so that was a bit of a mouthful, but it is very specific. So let's talk about what we see here. First of all, you'll notice that we have the verb form of the choice as opposed to the noun form. So when I say noun form, I mean things like uses juxtaposition or maybe uses a metaphor, something like that. It's better, in my opinion, to use the verb form if at all possible. Now, the noun form is not wrong. If you identify a choice, whether it's a noun or a verb, you are still identifying a choice, and that is part of what makes it defensible. So what I did here is I used the verbs compares and contrasts, and then we have contrasting. And notice that it says to evoke a sense of pity. So that would be a reference to pathos or to an emotional appeal. I prefer that students don't actually use the words logos, ethos, and pathos in their essay. It's okay to identify them. Oftentimes they are actually created by other choices, but it sounds a little bit rough if you just say uses logos. It's not very precise. So if you're thinking about, in this case, pathos and emotional appeal, you want to specify which emotion it is. And so this is one way to convey that without using the phrase pathos or emotional appeal. And then we want to get to the fact that she has a call to action. So you can see the verb calling here. And then I put this in purple just to kind of have it stand out, but her argument is to end child labor. She's against child labor. So you want it to be clear what the argument is or what the message is or what the author's stance on a particular issue is, because that is relevant to their perspective and it helps you convey their purpose as well, because she wants these people to join together with the men to end child labor. So that would be just sort of like a one-sentence introduction. Okay, so now let's talk about the short intro. This is what I think most of my students are going to do on the exam because they tend to prefer this. It's a little bit more developed, but it's not quite as detailed, so it doesn't take as much time. So you'll see that I labeled it as context and thesis. And so when I said context right here, I just meant the historical context. And so if you know about the historical context or it's given to you in the passage and you can include those details, it can be very helpful. So in this case, we're talking about how it's at the turn of the 20th century. So the speech itself was from 1905. So that's just a different way to say that. And we're looking at the women's rights issues of the time. So women did not have the right to vote, and as such did not have a full voice in the creation of the laws. So the reason I started talking about the women's right to vote in the early 20th century is because she's speaking to a group of suffragists. So you want to include relevant historical context or relevant background information. Now, as far as the thesis, this is relatively similar to the previous example that we talked about. You can see that I underlined verbs as well. So we have compares and contrasts. We also have offers vivid details as far as choices, and again, that same purpose, in order to develop her argument that the suffragists should join with the men to end child labor. So in this one, I actually included the phrase to develop her argument, which could be a potentially useful phrase if you are faced with a prompt that asks about the argument. So now let's look at the actual thesis. I included the same idea here, but the syntax is a bit different just so that you guys can see a different way to do it in case you want a little bit of variety. And so you'll notice that I still underlined the different verbs. We have compares and contrasts and also offers vivid details. And then the purple there is the purpose. In the purpose section there, I put that she does it in order to develop her argument. So if your prompt is about developing an argument or conveying a message, you might use that phrasing in your thesis. It is okay to do so. And so one thing that I want to call your attention to in terms of the syntax is that this time I put the information about her audience here kind of in between as opposed to at the beginning of the sentence. And so we still have the same information. Activist Florence Kelley, in her passionate speech to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, compares and contrasts the child labor laws. And then it continues. So if you prefer this type of syntax, it's fine as well. And to check your subject-verb agreement, you'll notice that we have our speaker, Florence Kelley, and then compares. So she compares, that would make sense. So you just sort of ignore this middle portion. And so that would be a different thesis. It's saying the same thing essentially. It's just that it's a little bit more detailed in some sense. It has a different syntax. So that is just a stylistic choice. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about these more developed intros because some students actually like to do this. And so again, my recommendation is that you don't try for this if you don't have enough time, or if you're struggling to get started, this is not the method that I would recommend. That being said, some students like to have a hook. When I say hook, I mean a universal truth or sort of like this broader opening statement that helps you narrow down to the issue at hand. So if you think of it like an inverted triangle, the hook is going to be this universal truth. Your context is the historical context and your reference to the exact passage that you're talking about. And then you have your thesis, which identifies the choices and purpose or message, argument, whatever you're asked to write about. So the hook is not needed. It is not supposed to be super flashy though. I don't recommend using a rhetorical question as a hook or some kind of quote. Usually that feels a bit forced. So here we have two different ones. The first one is every child should have the ability to just be a kid. So in this one, we're focusing on the idea of child labor. That's what it's building to. And the second one here though, it's talking about this idea that certain people in society have a voice and others don't, and that would be connected to women's rights, and then ultimately the fact that these child workers didn't have the rights that they should have. And so those are two different hooks there that you could see. So let's talk about the context for a second. So this sample would read, every child should have the ability to just be a kid. Florence Kelley understood that. So now we've narrowed it down to our speaker. A staunch supporter of women's rights, Kelley was also an active voice against the harsh labor laws of the early 1900s. So here we have some background information. Instead of calling her an activist, we've called her a staunch supporter of women's rights. And it also talks about how she was active in terms of being against these child labor laws. So this would be the historical context as well. So that would be a method that you could use if you didn't want to use the term activist. Maybe you like this phrasing over here. So that would be the context. And then if we scroll down a little bit, I'll show you guys the thesis. So this is very similar to the previous ones. Again, we have our tone word here, and you could include 2 tone words if you wanted to. You could say maybe her logical yet passionate speech. It's up to you. If there's a tone shift that you want to talk about, that might be a way to include a reference to that tone shift. And here we have presents examples. So giving examples that are factual examples is going to be very logical. Using examples is a way that she furthers her point. So that would be the choice that I intend to analyze. And in the other samples, I talked about comparison and contrast, but she's doing those same things at the same time. She's using examples to create a comparison and contrast. So it really just depends on which one you want to include in your thesis. This one was just a little bit different. I wanted to show you guys another choice that you could use instead of using the same choices over and over again, because I know some students are concerned about identifying choices. Well, incorporating examples is also a choice. And then here it says offers a detailed account. And so that's just another way to say this right here, offers vivid details. And that would be how she, in my opinion, is creating this emotional appeal. She does use contrast a little bit in that section as well. And I could talk about that in my body paragraphs. I don't necessarily need to include every single point I want to make in my thesis. Now, if you have 2 main ideas, one for each of your body paragraphs, or 3 main ideas, one for each of your body paragraphs, and you want to do what some people call a 3-pronged thesis or a 2-pronged thesis, that's fine. As long as it's defensible, as long as you're talking about choices and purpose, it's okay. If you are doing more of a chronological analysis and kind of looking at it section by section, then you kind of want to basically identify the main point of that section. And so sometimes strategies are working together in a particular section, so you need to just choose the phrasing that makes the most sense for your thesis. And then, like with the other examples, we have the purpose here as well. So now let's look at this one. So this one was the one where it was talking about this idea of giving people a voice and who has a voice and who doesn't. So this one would read, those with a voice in society have a responsibility to speak up for those who are marginalized. And then the context that's related to that would be, though not entirely powerless, women at the turn of the 20th century did not have the right to vote in the United States. Children, however, particularly those working in factories, arguably were even more marginalized due to the harsh labor laws or lack of labor laws in general at the time. So here what we've done is we've referenced the time period, so it's the 20th century or early 20th century, and then we also have the reference to the United States because this is going to be a national issue. So that's giving a bit of the historical context, and it's kind of narrowing it down to what Florence Kelley is actually going to be talking about. So that would be how you could connect that hook to the context. And again, this one's more involved, so this one is not one that I would recommend for everyone to attempt because in theory, it could take you longer than you really should be spending on an intro. So the thesis here is a bit of a different structure, so this is another option that you might consider. This one says, speaking at a women's suffrage convention in Philadelphia, activist Florence Kelley provides examples of the shortcomings of state laws and offers vivid descriptions of the children's work environment in order to evoke a sense of frustration and pity from her audience, thus making them more receptive to her call to join with male voters to work together to end child labor. So what I like about this one in terms of how it's different from the previous ones is we have this clause at the beginning to kind of give us that context of the location. So speaking at a women's suffrage convention in Philadelphia. So that would be a way to include that conversation about the location without actually having to do it like this over here where you gave the name. So this one's a bit more general, but I think it flows well. And then we have the choices, provides examples, offers vivid descriptions in order to evoke. So that's talking about the emotional appeal. And then her call to action And ultimately, we understand that her stance is to end child labor. As a quick note, where it says receptible, it should be receptive. Sorry, y'all, I was tired. So now I want to show you guys some body paragraphs, and these are possibly more developed than what you as a student will do when you're encountering a passage for the very first time, given that you only have a relatively limited amount of time to write this essay. So I want to kind of show you guys some recommendations for what I might call best practices or recommendations, but I don't expect you to implement every single one of these tips. This is more for demonstration purposes. So one thing that students need to be aware of is that you should have a strong topic sentence. So a weak topic sentence would be something like, one choice Florence Kelley uses is, because that's not really giving you a very sophisticated approach. You're just kind of listing different choices in each paragraph. So we want to focus on a choice or focus on a main point, and we want that to be clear in our topic sentence. I recommend that you include the purpose in there as well. So here what I did is I did almost like a little bit of foreshadowing. I tried to think about what her goal of the speech was. So what was her overall purpose? And I included that here in the beginning that I highlighted in yellow. So this intro of the sentence itself is not necessarily necessary, but it could be a technique that you use. So the sentence reads, in order to ultimately convince her audience that the unjust child labor laws are just as paramount of a concern as women's suffrage, Florence Kelley must first prove that these harsh laws are an urgent and widespread issue. So if you think about it, when someone's developing an argument, they have to first identify the problem, and then they have to start developing their claim. So we need a problem. In this case, it's child labor. And why is it a problem? Well, it's an urgent and widespread issue. So that's how she starts off the speech. And then I'm going to talk about how she uses different examples to prove her claim. So she makes a claim and then she has to prove her claim. And so, like I said, this part right here that I highlighted in yellow might not be necessary, but what I did here was I tried to think about what her overall call to action was going to be, and then I kind of foreshadowed that in the beginning of this sentence because she's building up to it. So in order to build up to her call to action, she first has to prove that there's a problem. So this might be a technique that you use, especially if your prompt has to do with developing an argument. Okay, so you'll notice that I actually have some blue text here, and that is because that is any reference that I had to the text itself, either a direct quote or a paraphrase, just sort of a reference to the passage, because a lot of students have asked how many pieces of evidence you need, and I use the expression pieces of evidence, but I don't normally set a quota for my students because I recommend that they layer their evidence and commentary, and sometimes they might include one piece of evidence and some commentary, but other times there might be related pieces of evidence and they just have more commentary and they create layers. I think layers are going to be one of the things that will help students get a higher score. So we'll talk about what layers are in a second. So here it says, after noting that there are over 2 million child laborers in the United States, so that was just referencing something that she said, an astounding number in and of itself, Kelley offers examples of the unjust laws in order to support her claim. So my paragraph right now is going to be focusing on these examples. So that would be the major choice that I want to talk about. So I had to kind of lead into that a little bit. But why is she giving examples? Well, she's trying to prove that it's an urgent and widespread issue, it being child labor in this case. So that is a piece of evidence right here, but it's just a quick paraphrase. So you want to stay grounded in the text. You want to use information from the text to your advantage. And you also want to keep it relatively simple. You don't want to include long quotes because that can slow you down and it's going to waste your time, in my opinion, because you're going to be copying these long quotes and then you're not going to have the opportunity to write as much commentary. So we want to embed the quotes or include a paraphrase. That way you're able to have it read more smoothly. I like for students to, if possible, try to include at least one embedded direct quote per paragraph, just because sometimes if it's all paraphrase, it can look like summary, but that's not a magical fix. It's just kind of a preference. So take that as you will. I tend to like to see a quote somewhere in the paragraph, but again, that's just my preference. So we have this idea of examples, and so now we need to actually get into those examples. So I established that I want to talk about the examples, but now I need to actually look at these examples. And a lot of times with examples as a choice, writers give like 3 or 4, and so it can be difficult to talk about all of them given the amount of time that you have. So I'm going to show you guys a way to kind of compress that a little bit. You don't want it to be too heavy on summary, but you do kind of need to give a little bit of the explanation of these examples as well. So it says, while 2 million is a shocking number, Kelley's claim becomes more real when she notes that children under the age of 16 cannot work more than 8 hours a night. So I put real in quotes here because it's just kind of adding emphasis there. And real is kind of a casual term, so I put it in quotes to kind of indicate that I understood it was casual, but I couldn't think of a better word at the time. So this is also a reference to something that was said in the passage as well. So what I did in my notes section is I tried to pull different quotes that I felt were important, but as I was writing, if I didn't have a quote in my notes, I at least annotated chronologically so I knew where to go back to if I wanted to find something that I could use, like a specific fact like this. So it says, although not an ideal law, as children should be sleeping at night, not working an adult length shift in a factory, Alabama's laws remain some of the best in the South. So that right there is sort of a paraphrase of something that Florence Kelley said. And this helps me introduce my first example, which was her first example, because she started talking about Alabama, and then she contrasted it with Georgia's laws because they're both in the South. So you can see that I referenced that here. Kelley then contrasts Alabama's laws with Georgia's laws, noting that in Georgia, there's no restriction whatsoever. So this allows me to reference a choice that she made because she did this contrast. But also, I'm including these 2 examples, and it's a bit of a summary, but I do have a direct quote in there as well. So when I say to embed a quote, this is what I mean. Basically, you're taking a portion of what the writer said, and you are working it into a sentence of your own. Now, you'll notice that I didn't include any line numbers because you don't technically have to do that for the AP exam. In fact, sometimes as teachers, we give you guys passages that don't have line numbers, so you don't need to cite the line number or the paragraph for the exam. Just keep that in mind. For a college essay or maybe a high school essay that is a class assignment, you are probably going to want to do MLA citations for something like this. So it's good to know how to do that, but you don't necessarily need the proper citations for this particular experience. So here I tried to actually analyze a bit of the audience a little bit. So it says, perhaps anticipating her fellow suffragists might presume that child labor is a Southern problem, Kelley demonstrates that it is not in fact an isolated issue when she states that New Jersey recently appealed a good law. So what I noticed was that Florence Kelley started talking about the South, and then she shifted and talked about the North. And she basically said it's not just a Southern problem. However, she didn't actually say those words. So I had to ask myself, why does she make that shift? And why does she try to note that it's not just a Southern problem? Well, she could anticipate that people would assume it was a Southern problem because her first 2 examples were from the South. And she's working, geographically speaking, by giving the faraway examples and then working close to home, which we're going to talk about in a second. So this little phrase right here was a way to explain why she made that choice. She was perhaps worried that her audience would assume it was a Southern problem, so she's working to clarify. Here it says New Jersey recently repealed a good law. And so we need to explain why she thinks it's a good law and why she's upset that it was repealed. So it says, without this law in place, children have the pitiful privilege of working all night long. So notice that I have a quote here as well. So you see how there are 2 different pieces of evidence relatively close together, but I'm using that to help explain Kelley's argument and explain what she's doing. So that's why when students ask how many pieces of evidence you need, My recommendation would be sort of like a minimum of 2, but it really depends on what you're writing. You can include more, especially if you have a more developed paragraph. So that's kind of one of those things where I'm hesitant to set a rule because it really just depends on what you're writing and what your style is. So we address the audience a little bit here by examining what they might assume, but we can also examine the context and the location as well. So she started to talk about a law in Pennsylvania. She's speaking in Philadelphia, which is in Pennsylvania. So a lot of times speakers tailor their speech to the location that they are actually speaking in because they make it more relevant to the audience. And so that was important because of the order of her examples. So sometimes when writers give examples, it might be in chronological order, depending on what the examples are. In this case, it's more of a geographical order, starting with the farthest away from her audience and building to the one that is close to home, because that is going to be the most personal or relatable. So in this case, we're providing commentary on the particular order of the examples. So she made the choice to include examples, and right now I want to analyze why she put them in the order that she did. So we continue with, by noting that a 13-year-old can work 12 hours per night, Kelley gives her audience an opportunity to realize that the issue of child labor is not a faraway problem. It is a widespread and urgent matter that requires rational and compassionate adult intervention. So here you can see some of the phrasing that I referenced early on in the paragraph. So I'm just trying to create a little bit of cohesion here. That I had already mentioned, it's a widespread and urgent matter, and so I'm reinforcing that this is the reason why she's doing so. And also, I noticed that because she's using these examples, that it was an appeal to logic or reason, but notice that I never said logos here. However, I do use the phrase rational, which suggests that she's creating a logical appeal, and then I also put the word logically prove here as well. So that's a way to examine logos a bit more subtly, because my major choice here is the examples, and then I'm talking a little bit about the contrast within the examples and how that creates a logical appeal. So rather than analyzing this as logos, I'm actually looking at what caused that logical appeal, and I'm kind of weaving that logic in at the end. And then here, I did something similar to the topic sentence. So this is just another technique that you could use to think about the ultimate goal. So this might be redundant because of that phrasing being used earlier on, but it's a way to kind of finish out this paragraph. So what is her end game here? Her end game is to create a call to action. And so knowing that she wants to get them to join with the male voters, she has to first prove it's a problem. She has to start to get that buy-in, and she's not going to have that buy-in if people don't agree with her that it's a problem. So she has to prove it. And that's what she did at the beginning of her speech. And that's what I'm trying to discuss here, is how she proves that it's a problem. Okay, so body paragraph 2 is a bit shorter, but it still has layers of evidence and commentary. I didn't actually color code the evidence this time because I felt like that was more obvious in the first body paragraph. But what I want to talk about here is how to transition between paragraphs. And this is just one recommendation. I'm not saying that this is the only way or even the best way. But one thing that I have found kind of helps as far as flow and also line of reasoning is that you can reference what you spoke about in the previous paragraph and then use that as a bridge to transition to your new main idea. So you can see that I did that here. It says, having already demonstrated that the unjust child labor laws are a matter of national concern, Florence Kelley furthers her argument by providing vivid details of the children's work experiences in order to garner sympathy from her audience. So this first part here might not be necessary, but this is what I was calling the bridge, because it's talking about what she said in the previous paragraph, and it's noting the major movements of her piece. So first she has to prove that there is a problem, and now she's developing her claim. And so this expression here could also be useful to some of you, furthers her argument. And so if your prompt is asking about developing an argument, you could also use the expression to further an argument or to bolster the argument. That means to strengthen it. So the major choice that I'm going to be talking about now are the vivid details, and I need to include the purpose. Remember, we want to have what and why. So the what is going to be the vivid details, and the why is going to be that she's attempting to garner sympathy from her audience. So that would be referencing an emotional appeal, again, without actually using the word pathos. So it says, by listing the luxuries that these children craft in sweaty, noisy factories, Kelley engenders a combination of sympathy and frustration. Sympathy for the fragile, innocent girls, and frustration in regard to the presence or lack thereof these laws. So notice that I use the word listing here. One choice that you might recognize is parallelisms. So in the passage itself, she started to list all the things that the kids did and all the things that the kids made. But instead of actually saying she uses parallelism, I'm just saying that she's listing it because the list was in parallel structure. And also I included some detail here that you might be interested to note, because in the passage, she referred to it as the sweating system, I believe, and then she talked about how noisy it was. And these were details that I noted as I was reading it. And so since I can't really work in the phrase sweating system here as a direct quote, I can use sweaty as an adjective because I want to try to prove why the factories were bad, if you will. So we know why Florence Kelley is upset about it, but I haven't actually really conveyed that to my reader yet. So I mentioned the work conditions and the work experiences, but that's still kind of vague. So using these descriptors here help to convey the hardships that these children go through. Now, I could have detailed that more using some direct quotes from the passage, but I want to kind of keep focus on the details and what I'm talking about. And I'm also interested in how these details create this emotional appeal. So the emotions that I want to talk about are sympathy and frustration. So I listed those here, and then I put a colon and I tried to kind of qualify what I meant. So sympathy for whom and frustration about what. So then it says, this frustration becomes deeper when the women realize that while they might want to create change, they do not have the power to do so without the right to vote. So this is a way to incorporate the historical context into your paragraph. Several of you have asked, how do I actually do that outside of the introductory paragraph? And so this would be a way to do that, because we know that they are suffragists and they're at a convention for suffragists, essentially. We know that this group of people has a shared value. They are passionate about women's rights and particularly gaining the right to vote. Therefore, this is how you can kind of weave in that historical context as well, because the frustration that they're experiencing comes from the fact that they essentially cannot make laws to help these children. And she does point that out to them, which is what I'm actually trying to convey here when it says Kelley notes. Whoops, sorry guys, I had an alarm going off there. This is what I was trying to convey here when it says Kelley notes through the questions that she poses. So I would caution you guys, be very careful about calling something a rhetorical question, because not all questions are rhetorical, but she does ask a question. And so she's trying to lead her audience to recognize that if they could vote, then things might be different. So that's how I incorporated that particular part of the passage as well. And so then I need to ask myself, why does she do this? Like, why does she actually bring up the fact that they can't vote? It seemed to me that she was trying to do a couple different things. First of all, I didn't feel like she was actually trying to blame the men, but she did at least note that they could vote and the women couldn't. So another thing to think about was that she was pointing out that the women had all these luxuries that the children created. There were different parallels in the speech, and there was contrast between what the kids did and what the adults did. And so I needed to stop and ask myself, okay, why is she creating this dichotomy here? Why is she separating children and adults, and work and sleep, luxury and toil? And it was because she was trying to garner this sense of sympathy and ultimately frustration at the situation. So here it says, However, Kelley is cautious not to place the blame entirely on the men, as she notes that the women wear the luxurious garments, including undergarments, buckles, and hat pins that the children make. So this is a way to include some details as well, because I could have just said luxurious garments that the children make, but I thought it might be better to actually list a few of those garments just for specificity here. So she doesn't want to entirely blame the men. The women have some role in this as well because they're buying these garments, but she also doesn't want to entirely blame the women, because then if they feel like they're being attacked, they're not going to want to help her. Remember her ultimate goal. Her ultimate goal is to get them to join with her. If you want people to join with you, you don't want to attack them. You might want them to realize the errors of their ways and then join you, but you don't want to actually outright alienate them. So I tried to include that here. It says, however, not wanting to alienate her audience, as doing so would make them less likely to join her cause, Kelley does not blame her audience for partaking in luxuries. In fact, she unites herself with them by saying we and our, further highlighting the ideals of female solidarity that remain important to her audience of suffragists. So this is just a little note here about her pronoun usage, because when she started talking about this particular portion of the speech, she was using the pronoun we, which would be including herself. She was not saying you, she was saying we. Therefore, it's less of an attack because she's uniting herself with the audience, not blaming them. And this also is important because of the idea of women's rights and female solidarity. Rather than blaming them, she is uniting herself with them, because if she does that and puts herself at their level, so to speak, then they can work together to end this problem. And so she's trying to create this camaraderie, if you will, now, so that they will be more inclined to do what she wants later on in the speech, which is heed her call to action. So let's talk about this final paragraph here. Sometimes students don't have the opportunity to write a conclusion, and so if you need to actually end your essay with a body paragraph, I want to give you some tips on how to do that. Some of these tips will also apply to a conclusion itself. So just some general ideas on how to end an essay. So what I did here in yellow is I tried to kind of recap my major points, knowing that this was the last paragraph I was going to write. So this paragraph is sort of a body paragraph focused on the call to action, but it's also got elements of a conclusion, because time-wise, I knew that I had to kind of have this dual purpose. So the topic sentence here kind of serves as a summary sentence to lead into this paragraph. So we've got the reference to logical evidence, which she created through the use of examples. That was body paragraph 1. And then here we've got a reference to pathos or emotional appeals, which were created through vivid details, which was the major point in body paragraph 2. And it says to effectively build her argument against child labor. So I think it's important to take little moments like this to specify what the argument is or what the person's message is, so that we know the stance on the issue. Even though that's already been established, it's good to create some kind of cohesive layer here to kind of refresh that point. So I tell my students that the majority of the time you use the word argument, you want to explain what the person's argument is and try to vary your phrasing a little bit. And I think the same would go for a message as well. So the paragraph continues by saying, knowing that the suffragists are not strangers to activism, so again, just kind of analyzing the audience there, Kelley capitalizes upon this, asking them to join her. So now I'm introducing the call to action. But how can these women end child labor if they cannot vote to repeal these laws and replace them with more lawful regulations? So now I'm actually posing a question. I would recommend not overdoing this. I actually have a student this year in my sophomore English class who loves rhetorical questions and loves questions in general in her essays, and she usually includes like 3 or 4, and I've had to ask her to kind of scale back. And my advice to her was this: it's okay to use them because you as a writer should be making choices as well, but we want to make sure they're meaningful. And sometimes inundating your reader with questions seems like kind of like a cheap tactic. So if you're going to use a question, that's fine, but make sure you're using it effectively. And sometimes when you use multiple questions back to back in an essay like this, it can feel like it's a gimmick as opposed to a genuine choice. So just kind of keep that in mind. But the question here allows for a little bit of personality or voice perhaps in this essay. So then it says, Kelley calls her audience to join with the male voters to enact change. So again, just kind of establishing the call to action. In order for this passionate cry to be effective, Kelley must carefully build to this charge. So again, we've been talking about this throughout the essay, that she's building to the call to action. She cannot commence her speech by asking the women to join with the men without risking potential contempt from suffragists who might be disinclined to join with the men, perhaps because they have a right that the suffragists so vehemently desire. So that's just kind of analyzing the structure a little bit. It's kind of saying, okay, she made these choices for a reason. She couldn't just start with the call to action. She had to build to it, because if she started with her call to action, then people might not have agreed with her. Again, she had to prove that problem and develop that before she actually got to the call to action. So sometimes you can analyze the choice in abstraction almost. Here's what she did, because if she had done the opposite, it wouldn't have worked. In this regard, Florence Kelley carefully crafts a balanced speech, logically and emotionally proving that this issue requires immediate attention. So again, we're just kind of reiterating some points that we've already made here, logically and emotionally, and also this idea of immediate action. So basically kind of restating some of my major points throughout the essay here as a way to kind of tie it all together. After all, these children cannot help themselves. These girls can barely reach the bobbins, let alone vote. So reaching the bobbins was a reference to something that Florence Kelley said in the passage. Therefore, the adults must protect and must ensure their safety, there being the children in this case, or the girls. So one way to end that could be useful is to ask yourself, what is the call to action, which we've already established? And then what happens if the audience listens to this call to action or heeds this call to action or warning? It might be a warning. And then what happens if they don't? So in this case, if they listen to Florence Kelley and do what she asks and they actually join with the men, well, then they're going to work together to create positive change for the future, which is what Florence Kelley wants. So I tried to incorporate that here to kind of close out the essay. So it says, if the suffragists are willing to join with the men, together they can not only make meaningful change in the present, but also for future generations as well. Okay, so that is a walkthrough of how I might write an essay. I tried to demonstrate a few different techniques here and show you guys how to connect your ideas. So if you found these tips useful, maybe not all of them, but some of them, because I don't want you guys to totally try to overhaul your writing style, but rather refine it. If you found it useful, please give this video a thumbs up. That lets me know that you like the content. It also tells other teachers and students that this video might be of use to them. Or if you just want to give it a thumbs up because you are cramming for that AP Lang exam, that's probably hours away at this point if you watch this when it's uploaded, then give this video a thumbs up as well, because my goal was to provide you guys with as much content as possible to prepare. So best of luck on the exam, guys. Write as much as you can, believe in yourself, and submit before the timer goes off. So until next time, guys, happy writing!